Before the sun settles its hand on the prairie, the wind moves first. It comes low over the long grass, smells of damp earth and horse, and whispers across the blackjack oak as if reminding the land to keep its secrets. On a far ridge, a rider sits still enough to be mistaken for a dead cedar snag, hat brim pulled down until darkness and felt become one thing. Out there, between the Arkansas River and a skein of half-seen trails where outlaw hooves have thinned the grass, one name travels faster than rumor, and just as quietly, Bass Reeves, a man who learned to move like weather, a man whose word was as heavy as iron, and whose arrival, when it came, sounded like thunder held in the belly of the sky. But the story does not begin with the badge. It starts in July 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, where a child was born enslaved to the Reeves family and given the name Bass. Childhood was not childhood as we think of it. No idle summers or schoolyard scraps. Only work and the constant arithmetic of survival. When the Reeves family moved westward into Texas, the boy moved with them, part of a human inventory scarred by bills of sale and the seasons of dust. In that hard country, he grew tall and steady-eyed, a figure already hinting at the man he would become, though no one could have guessed it then. War changed everything, changed men, counties, and the maps nailed up behind courthouse desks. Somewhere in those years of crackling brush fires and gray columns and the ground shaking under artillery, Bass slipped the chain of bondage. Accounts differ on the spark that set him running, but the trail is clear enough. He moved north and west into the Indian Territory, toward a landscape that taught its own scripture, read in deer sign, in river fords, in the way fire dies in cottonwood ash. Among Cherokee Creek and Seminole neighbors, he found the space to breathe and the humility to listen. He learned languages and customs, accepted instruction from people who had long measured distance, not just with miles, but with stories. And he learned the patient watchfulness of a man who must cross a hostile ridge and return alive. Some historians believe he may have served alongside the Union's native regiments, but whether in arms or under quiet protection, it was here he learned the territory like a cook knows her kitchen. When the guns went silent and the nation tried to remember itself, Bass walked back toward the edges of the Arkansas line, near Van Buren, where freight traffic and riverboats stitched together the borderlands. He had no diploma, no ledger of formal skills, but the territory itself had become his reference. Landowners and lawmen needed guides who could spirit a posse through live oak and switchgrass without kicking up a mile-long rumor. Traders and drovers needed someone who knew which creek could be crossed in flood and which would take a wagon whole if you misread the light. Bass did the work, quiet and exact, the way a blacksmith hammers steel until the shape holds the first hint of a blade. He found a steadier life with his wife Jenny, gathered family around him, and built a reputation for never losing a trail he intended to keep. The frontier he moved through was not a single story, it was a braid. Along the river towns, you could find a schoolhouse bell and a coffin maker on the same street. In the Nations, you could ride past a church made of split pine and a whiskey camp with more bullets in its walls than in its customers. Formerly enslaved men built futures where they could. Native leaders debated sovereignty under a century's weight of broken treaties. Migrants from the East arrived with the fever of American becoming. A deputy's horse might leave Fort Smith in the morning and by sundown step into a council fire circle. Two legal worlds meeting in the dust between hoofprints. Europa's maps did not fit the place, and Bass's advantage was that he knew it, felt it in his bones, and made no false claims to mastery over what could not be mastered. Some nights when camp was set in a pecan bottom and the coffee hissed in the pot, Bass would talk little and listen much. He learned that a mother in a farm cabin could tell you more about a road than any scout's boast if you asked about the baby's fever and meant it. He learned that when a freedman's well ran foul, he could trade a day of his strength for a clean bucket and a neighbor gained. He learned that the cook's small miracles, a biscuit, a hot skillet, could carry a man farther than bravado. And crucially, he learned that power carried quiet best. The loud men with shiny boots went to town. The quiet ones came back with what they'd gone to fetch. His mind was a ledger written in dust. He could not read or write in the white man's script, not yet. But memory for him was not an accident. It was a tool and a discipline. He kept faces, scars, ways of walking, and the way certain men lied by blinking too much when they said friend. Later, when clerks recited warrants aloud, Reeves would hold their words like a far-off compass, bearing fixed stars to steer by. That practice, born of necessity, would become legend in time. The illiterate deputy who never brought in the wrong man because the law had been spoken into him first, and he had stored it where no rain could smudge the ink. The territory itself demanded a particular kind of courage, less the fireworks of a street duel and more the long, cold work of following sign after everyone else had gone home. It meant riding out when the cottonwoods were white with frost and the creeks wore thin armor. It meant sleeping light and waking lighter when coyotes sang too close. It meant knowing when to speak in a trader's porch light and when to approach a cabin without a word, hat in hand. The horse kept sideways to the door to offer no target. There were outlaws, yes, men who robbed stages and carried three names like a snake shed skins. But there were also the small desperations of poverty, quarrels that could be broken up with a steady gaze, and the shapeless threat of whiskey where none of the lines on any map could keep men safe. Bass learned to navigate it all, to tell the difference between a feud and a plague, and to bring back stories as carefully as he brought back men. By the early 1870s, the talk in border towns gathered around a new storm building upriver at Fort Smith. A federal judge was coming with orders to tame what government papers simply called the Indian Territory, a sweep of roughly 75,000 square miles of creeks, plains, and timber claimed by 5 sovereign nations, and haunted by men who did not like paying for cattle. They preferred to cut free by moonlight. A court without reach is a rumor. A court with reach is a machine that grinds men to powder if they get too close. Those who had watched Bass guide in and out of those same miles whispered that the machine, to work, would need riders who understood the country as he did. Riders who could be law without becoming swagger, who could move not like tourists, but like weather. The first time Reeves stood on the bluff above the Arkansas and looked across to where Fort Smith's streets shifted from mud to plank, he measured more than distance. He measured the years between his first breath as someone else's property and this moment, where word of a badge and a job might put him face to face with the men who thought they owned the night. In the water's dull shine, he could see both the boy he had been and the man he was already becoming. Not invulnerable, not without fear, but fluent in the language of these borderlands and stubborn enough to wear the work without it wearing him out. Night wind picked up. Somewhere in the dark, a cottonmouth lapped at the shallows and slid away. Behind Reeves, a lantern guttered in a riverfront window and recovered. In a few months, a judge's gavel would strike like a hammer on iron, and Reeves's name would be called not as a witness or a hired guide, but as Deputy United States Marshal. The war had scattered him. The territory had taught him. Now the law would test whether what he had learned could hold. He touched the worn stock of his rifle, looked once more toward the black ribbon of water, and led his horse down the path that would carry him into the rest of his life. Fort Smith did not look like the capital of order. It looked like a river town holding its breath. Mud along the Arkansas River baked to a crust by noon and broke into slippery ruts by evening. Freight wagons snarled on the levee. Somewhere a hammer rang in the blacksmith shop and a saloon piano threw a crooked melody out into the light. But inside the red brick courthouse, where windows caught the morning and made it hard to see a man's eyes, the talk was iron. A new federal judge, Isaac C. Parker, had been sent to bring law across a sweep of country bigger than most nations. Indian Territory, a patchwork of sovereign lands, treaty lines, and outlaw trails that spooled west for more than 75,000 square miles. A gavel came down, and the room felt smaller, the world suddenly tighter on its hinges. The order went out. Hire deputy U.S. Marshals who could ride far and come back with prisoners. Among the first names spoken by the men who knew the territory best was Bass Reeves. He had the languages. He had the tracks memorized in his bones. He could ride into a storm and return with the names it had tried to hide. Parker authorized the hiring of 200 deputies to scour that wild geography, though the ledger never held that full number. At any given time, 2 or 3 dozen men carried the weight of a continent's worth of rumor on their saddles. The judge's reach would be measured not only by his sentences, but by the miles his deputies wore into their horses' hooves. Reeves accepted his commission in 1875, stepped out of the crowd, and took up a badge that was not merely a piece of metal, but a promise whispered to the widows and storekeepers who watched the roads. Did the badge make the man? Or did the man give the badge its thunder? The courthouse doors swung, the river wind moved through, and the answer went riding. To understand the work is to understand the outfit. A Fort Smith deputy did not simply spur a horse and vanish. He built a small, moving world around the warrant. He arranged supplies and men, armed himself, and chose his road. The routine, if such hard work can be called routine, was stitched together by affidavits and expense slips that still survive. Deputies rode out on horseback alongside a grub wagon, the heart of the camp. A deputy hired a cook, who doubled as guard, and at least one posseman. They were an outfit in the old sense, a traveling company bound by coffee, bacon, and duty. They could be gone for weeks and cover 800 miles in a loop, west to forts with dust-whitened names, Reno, Sill, Anadarko, before turning back for the long glide into Fort Smith, with handcuffed men hunched in the wagon bed and the deputy's accounts ticking like a clock in his head. Money mattered, though none of them spoke of it as if it did. The government paid fees, so many cents per mile to and from an arrest, so many coins for a served subpoena, a little more once a prisoner's boots were pointed toward court. That arithmetic lived in the margins of a deputy's notebook. But the true math was done in daylight and dark. How many hours of decent traveling before the river rose? How many pounds of flour would feed a man, a cook, a guard, and 2 prisoners for 3 more nights? How many stories in a settlement were worth listening to? And how many were painted to frighten a lawman away? A deputy who failed at that math ran out of food or gun oil first, and then he ran out of luck. The ones who lasted, like Reeves, counted without a slate, and they counted on their feet. Law on this border was a braid, and Reeves understood its strands. The 5 nations, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, held their own courts and light horse police, but the strange crossroads of federal authority meant deputy U.S. Marshals from Fort Smith had the power to arrest anyone who broke federal law, white, black, or native. That authority, so plain on paper, struck hard against the lived facts of Jim Crow rising elsewhere in the South. To see a black lawman step down from the saddle with a federal writ and put irons on a white murderer was to glimpse a narrow doorway of justice in a century that kept slamming doors. Reeves walked through that doorway as if it had been built to his measure. He brought more than reach. He brought method, the quiet geometry of pressure and patience. He rarely wasted breath or bullets. He spoke softly at a cabin door and watched the way a man's wife folded her apron when she lied for him. He studied hoof cut where a deer track crossed it and knew how many riders, how fast, and how long ahead. He would ride the long way to catch a rumor in a cornfield rather than take the short way and be announced by the watchdogs on a front porch. The cook kept the coffee going. The possemen listened in the barns. The wagon's canvas kept the rain off both lawman and prisoner on the way back, because Bass preferred his bad men breathing when the judge asked their names. What did he carry in his pockets? Warrants folded to oilskin, a bone-handled knife, stray cartridges, maybe the kind of talisman a man holds at the bottom of his fist when the lightning crawls the horizon. An old coin, a rosary bead long since worn smooth. The badge rode above his heart, where a man places something he means to keep. Yet his edge was stranger than any charm. Bass Reeves could not read or write, but that limitation did not dim his precision. It hardened it. Before each ride, a clerk read the warrants aloud, and Reeves committed the names, scars, and kin-like scripture. A mole below the left eye, a cut on the right knuckle, a brother-in-law with a red mule. He carried the paper to show, but he carried the man's description in his head, which is where it mattered. He never brought in the wrong soul, not once, and if the prisoner himself could not read, Reeves made certain someone would speak the words so that the law was a sound heard by all present, clear as iron on an anvil. Memory was not a trick, it was a discipline, and he kept it honed the way a smith keeps a blade from rust. Then there were the costumes, less play acting than a hunter's choice of blind. Disguises, they called them, with a frontier half-smile that admitted danger even as it admired nerve. Reeves might appear as a dust-crippled tramp with a torn hat, his irons and pistol hidden deep. He might pass as a traveling preacher, voice lowered to a Bible's cadence. He might limp, or he might sing, or he might ask for a meal like any man down on his luck. It was a way to pass fences and dogs without raising a cloud. It was a way to sit at a kitchen table and hear a sister say that her brothers were off to the south pasture when her eyes said they were under the floor. When the time was right, the tramp stood straighter. The preacher's voice lost its hymn. The man in the doorway was all deputy, and the cuffs bit skin. The disguises were famous because they worked. The working of them was famous because Bass didn't talk about it. News of his methods ran ahead of him on the wind, and sometimes that wind did more work than the Winchester could. Out in the nations, a name could become a storm. You'd hear it on a porch where the nails still shone raw, at a trading post where flour swapped hands grain by grain, or in the hush of a jail wagon where a thief had too much time to think about the road that lay behind him and the one still to come. There were outlaws who hated him for what he represented, and others who feared him for the calm with which he arrived. There were also men who respected him the way a river town respects a flood. Dangerous, yes, but necessary, as old as the channel itself. Bass Reeves is on the road, someone would say, and a mother who heard it would pull her children inside and make the night a little quieter. In that season, just after his commission, the warrants stacked like cordwood on desks hidden beneath the courthouse's official order. Horse thieves working the Red River bends. Whiskey peddlers sneaking barrels over treaty lines. Murderers who believed the blackjack oak owed them cover for life. Reeves selected his first bundle and smoothed them flat. He would leave with dawn, ride a steady line west, and test his tactics against whatever waited beyond the next watercourse. He knew, as all seasoned riders knew, that a man can do everything right and still not come back. Yet he tightened the cinch, checked the breeching, inspected the grub wagon's wheel hubs, and climbed into the saddle as if crossing a familiar room. Beyond the river, beyond the broken glow of the last lantern swinging in the courthouse hall, two names in particular rode the night air like distant thunder. One was a woman whose pride might yet carry her to Fort Smith on her own terms. The other was a farmer turned desperado whose refusal to surrender had already killed good men. The deputy nudged his horse. The outfit creaked into motion. The hunt was beginning. They left Fort Smith before the town had fully gathered itself from sleep. Wagon creaking, coffee still hot in the pot, the river's damp chill hanging on the collars of their coats. West the road went, then south, shouldering through breaks of blackjack oak, then leveling into long prairie that let a man see his future and fear it. The warrants in Bass Reeves's pocket were already memorized, their details worn smooth in his mind like a creek stone, scars and aliases, a peculiar tilt to the left boot, the way one suspect chewed his lip when lying. The men he hunted tried to become fog. No shape, no edges, just rumor in the grass. Reeves made a practice of giving fog a face. They rode with a modest arrogance born of competence. The cook could shoot straight and, when needed, pray louder than any church bell. The posseman was young, but he watched sign without blinking and let his hands learn the discipline of silence. Reins slack, rifle balanced, breath controlled. Reeves himself was quiet enough to be mistaken for reluctance, but the silence in him was study. He was taking in the mile. He noted a smear of ash that meant a hasty fire doused with a boot heel. He noticed where a branch had chafed against a cinch ring and left a whisper of black on bark. He noticed crows riding a thermal above a cottonwood stand, too interested for this early hour. Perhaps a dead calf, perhaps a camp where the breakfast was late because the men within were listening for trouble. Toward the Red River the land hunkered down, and distances tricked the eyes. Brush country lay in ribbons, rough with thorns and birdsong, then open to bare flats where any rider looked like a coin dropped on a table. Shiny, exposed, worth stealing. Farms appeared and vanished. Cabins plastered with mud. Hogs nosing in the yard. Children at pumps who watched lawmen with the grave curiosity of the frontier-born. In settlements tied to Creek or Cherokee governance, a deputy could find a meal, a careful welcome, and intelligence offered without drama. 3 riders passed at dusk. 1 horse limped. They asked about a crossing 2 miles west. In freedmen neighborhoods strung along old military roads, Reeves spoke softly and was answered in kind. The people there knew the cost of keeping their own names clean and preferred their nights spent without strangers testing doors. What traveled ahead of him, even before the dust, was his habit of leaving men alive when he could. Reeves liked his prisoners to walk into the sunlight under their own legs, and out again only with the chains. That did not make him soft. It made him exact. He kept a steady tone even when a drunk in a doorway reached for bravado, and he counted his rounds the way a banker counts dollars. 3 for the fight, 3 for the road back. A little luck reserved in how he placed himself against a tree or a rock when the shooting started. People read that posture and kept their nerve where it belonged, behind their teeth. A name on the warrants rode the wind harder than the rest. Robert Bob Dozier. Farmer once, outlaw now by increments, stealing a steer to outlast a bad season, then a string of ponies for profit, then a man's life like a coin snatched from a barkeep's palm. Dozier had the frontier's talent for melting into the folds of country as if each ravine were a pocket sewn for him alone. Reeves's method with such men was to close the world around them, inch by inch. He asked after salt and bacon, not the man, and from a grocer's complaint about shortages, he could guess where a camp must be. He measured the nights by where dogs barked and where they did not. A place too quiet had its own confession. When he finally met Dozier, some say in winter's thin light, others under a clouded moon, the exchange burned brief and hard. The outlaw would not surrender. A few shots tore the air to threads. When the echo died, the country sounded larger for a moment, as if emptiness had been added to it. Reeves saddled, took what evidence the court would need, and rode on. Men would argue the exact day forever, but the trail after that carried one less set of boots. Legend keeps its own calendar. If Dozier proved how Reeves managed a man who mistook stubbornness for immortality, Belle's star marked a different talent. Belle moved through the territory wrapped in her reputation like a shawl, outlaw by charm and calculation, the kind of figure a dime novel would try to fit on the page without spilling. When word ran that the warrant naming her had landed in Bass Reeves's hands, another rumor walked with it, that she would choose her own path to court rather than meet him out where the blackjack oak kept the scores. Whether pride or prudence, her surrender echoed what folks already believed, that Reeves's name could press a decision upon a person before he ever dismounted at the door. The point is not whether she feared him. The point is that she respected the likelihood of his arrival. On this border, respect was simply another face of survival. Between these two poles, one outlaw dragged from the storm, the other stepping toward the law of her own accord, lay the daily work that made Reeves' legend more iron than tail. He wore disguises sparingly and well. Once he came to a sister's house ragged as any tramp, asked for a meal, and spoke with so little heat in his voice that the woman fed him and told him what she oughtn't. Brothers upstairs, guns on the hooks, horses saddled out back. It was not malice. Hunger and hospitality had always been a dangerous marriage. Reeves ate, praised the cooking, and waited until sleep pulled the house soft as felt. Then the iron slid home with a decisive sound, and the road north had 2 more sets of footprints in it. On another day, he took the voice of a traveling preacher and carried a Bible with a steel sole. He spoke a verse kindly to men whose hands twitched as if they were used to closing on pistol grips. When the mask dropped, the law stood where the story had been a moment before. None of this would have mattered had Reeves lacked the gift for listening. In Choctaw settlements, he sat on porches and let the elders set the speed of the talk. In Chickasaw pastureland, he watched boys breaking ponies and read in their technique which families handled horses and might be trading in stolen stock. At crossroads where a trader's sign swung and the dust tasted of flour, he asked about bullets, not because he needed them, though a man always needs them, but because ammunition purchases travel in pairs with trouble. He could be as gentle as rain, and he could be as sudden as thunder. But always he was attentive. The land taught this to anyone willing to learn. The first sound at dawn matters. A hawk's circle can tell you what disturbed the field below. A skillet set down too carefully in a cabin means a conversation is about to turn. Through gypsum canyons and over plains combed flat by cattle drives, Reeves tended a boundary. The law should be felt, not flaunted. He cut down a man when he had to. The papers counted 14 by the time the tallying was done, and always in self-defense. But when given the slight opening, he chose custody over the grave. That choice, repeated, became a kind of sermon in motion. It taught those who watched that justice was not a bolt of lightning striking at random, but a season that came on schedule. Warrants read aloud in the clerk's voice, a knock before dawn, a journey made under a watchful eye, and a day in court with the judge's questions like anchors. And for those who still thought to test him, the stories never warmed to their side. They said Bass had his hat shot off once and didn't move faster than the breeze that took it. They said he crossed a river in flood with a prisoner tied to his saddle horn and came out of the far bank counting calmly, as if both lives were figures in a ledger he meant to balance. By the time his outfit turned toward Fort Smith again, wagon heavier with irons, coffee bitter from being reheated too often, horses lean in the hips, the country itself seemed altered, as if some of its restlessness had been coaxed into a halter. The men in chains stared ahead or shut their eyes. It made little difference. They felt what countless others had felt in that rattling bed, that a particular season of their lives had been named and was ending. Reeves didn't gloat and didn't sermonize. He kept the peace on the road, shared the stew, and let the miles lecture. Once back inside the red brick courthouse, he stood with the patient dignity of a craftsman presenting a finished piece. Not flashy, but square, true, durable. Sometimes that's what thunder leaves behind. Not splinters, but structure. And yet even structure must face fire. The next warrant bundle on the clerk's desk looked like any other. Paper is a liar that way, but a turn in Reeves's road waited up ahead. Before that reckoning, there were still towns to pass through, rumors to test, and one last camp to make beneath a sky that brightened like a forge. Reeves tightened the cinch, took a long breath of wood smoke and dew, and set his horse toward the next mile. The territory kept no man gentle for long, not even the just, and the badge he wore would ask a price that only iron could pay. The docket had a way of piling up like storm cloud, and even the best riders came back to Fort Smith with dust in their lungs and iron in their pockets that did not jingle the way money does. Bass Reeves finished one such long circuit with the look of a man who'd put his will across 100 miles and found it still holding. Prisoners delivered, affidavits signed, expenses tallied in the clerk's neat hand. The streets outside were wet from a brief noon thunderburst. The smell of rain on wagon boards drifted through the open windows. Bass stood a little apart, hat in his hands, listening to the courthouse clatter. He had done this dance enough to know its steps. Wages and fees, a handful of hours with family, a fresh packet of warrants, and then the road again. He had measured his life in the arithmetic of miles and the grammar of duty. But the frontier is a place where even the practiced hand can slip. The fall, when it comes, is sudden. They were camped in light timber, nothing but bird song and a skillet's hiss, when the rifle balked. The cook, William Leach, was a steady man with quick hands, good with dough, and with a shotgun borrowed from Providence. Bass worked the lever of his Winchester to clear a stubborn round. He had done it 100 times, never once letting haste marry mischance. But this time the cartridge went off with a spiteful crack, while his attention was threaded between the jam and the trouble they had tracked all morning. Smoke jumped. A man fell like a tent line cut loose. In the silence that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath the way it does after lightning, as if the air itself could not quite accept the fact of what had happened. Bass sent for a doctor as if speed could turn the clock back. It could not. Leach was gone. The law's camp robbed of its most human sound, the cook's everyday talk, and the comfort of hot bread. The trial came in 1887 and brought with it the peculiar cold of a courthouse when a man's honor is on the stand. Those walls had seen killers and thieves. Now they held the weight of a lawman's mistake. Bass wore a plain coat. He gave his account without embroidery, the butt of the truth firm against his shoulder. The Winchester jam, his attempt to clear it, the shot that tore the camp in two. Witnesses spoke to his character and to the long miles he'd ridden without a whisper of cruelty. The government lawyers asked their hard questions because that is what the government must do. The jury listened as if to weather. When the verdict came, acquittal, it did not ring like triumph. It sounded instead like a bell struck at dusk. The day is over. The damage remains. Acquittal is not a salve for grief. Leach's absence traveled with the outfit like a gap in the line that no amount of tightening can hide. And acquittal is not a salve for debt. The legal fees hit like a stampede. Bass sold his home to square the ledger, gathered his family, and moved. Men on the frontier learned early that the price for doing right is sometimes paid not in glory, but in mortgage and sleep. Reeves did not complain. He took the loss as if it were one more mile to be ridden in steady silence. Back on the trail, he seemed, if anything, more careful in how he measured the world. The rifle he cleaned with the same attention a priest gives to chalice and paten. The camp he set with an eye for fields of fire and for the small mercies that make men decent. Coffee ready before first light, boots dried by the coals, a word of thanks to the cook who had taken Leach's place. When it came to violence, he obeyed the narrow code he'd always held: draw only when drawn upon, fire straight, end the fight, and keep around for the road home. The newspapers later counted 14 men dead by his hand, all in self-defense, a cruel tally written not as boast but as ledger entry. It was never the number that mattered to Reeves. It was the discipline that kept the number from being larger. The court's geography shifted with the decade. In 1893, Reeves transferred south to the federal bench at Paris, Texas, a town where the wind tugged at men's coats as if hurrying them along. The work did not change. The outlaws did, or rather their names did, while their habits remained the same. Whiskey traders tried the old tricks under new moons, floating contraband over treaty lines and into places federal law said it must not go. Rustlers grew clever about the brands they burned and the paths they cut to confuse a ranger's eyes. Reeves learned those new edges the way a smith learns the peculiar temperament of fresh steel. Test, listen, tap. Never assume yesterday's heat will serve today's purpose. Then came Muskogee in 1897, with its streets angling toward a century about to change its clothes. Here the legal braid pulled tightest. The Five Nations policed their own with light horsemen, proud and efficient. But the federal writ reached across like a long shadow whenever a crime claimed the government's interest. Reeves took care to ride not over, but alongside, respecting tribal leadership, asking for cooperation instead of assuming it. He learned who in each district could be trusted for an honest word, and which sheriff or captain liked the smell of his own authority too much to be useful. The work could grow tense in the gap between sovereignties. It is a difficult thing to be a guest with a badge. Reeves managed it by remembering names and by letting his actions declare his motives. He wanted bad men, not headlines. Those years brought him face to face with names the papers liked to print in big type. The Seminole outlaw Greenleaf, a figure who could not decide whether he was more man or legend, drew Reeves into thorny miles where water hides under reeds and gun smoke hangs close to the ground. The chase did not need poetry. It needed endurance and a willingness to be miserable longer than the man you hunted. Reeves possessed both. As for other infamous cases, like the Ned Christie affair, so often tangled up in retellings, Reeves's name sometimes wandered into the story the way driftwood catches on a bend. What mattered to Reeves was the line between the proven and the boasted. He kept to the proven. Let the storytellers spin. He would bring in his man and let the record keep itself. The wider country was changing under his horse's hooves. Railroads gnawed deeper into the prairie, bringing towns up out of the grass like mushrooms after rain. Telegraph wires stitched the horizon. With each mile of track, the distances that had once sheltered fugitives began to shrink. Yet the territory still held pockets of wildness, and Reeves remained at home in them. He would leave Muskogee at dawn with a warrant and return weeks later with 3 prisoners, because one name led to a porch light, and that porch light to a cousin's barn, and that barn to a man sitting very still behind a stack of seed sacks, holding his breath like a turtle. The deputies' patience outlasted their stillness. If the nation was modernizing, its prejudices were not. Beyond the nations, Jim Crow hardened like bad concrete. Even within them, men carried the century's sickness in their pockets. Reeves's presence, black, authoritative, unabashed, cut against those habits. Some white suspects learned only then the federal meaning of the badge on his chest. Others already knew and handled the revelation badly. Bass did not raise his voice to match their surprise. He let the paperwork and the iron speak the language of the Republic. In doing so, he taught witnesses and bystanders a useful lesson: that law, properly practiced, cares less for a man's complexion than for the weight of the charges against him. In lonely places, that lesson felt like a candle in wind, but a candle is still light. He kept working through heat that made the air taste of iron filings and cold that blistered men's cheeks until they looked windburned to leather. The money never matched the mileage. The respect sometimes did. Children in certain neighborhoods watched him ride past with eyes that said, "Here is a way to stand in this world without bending." Storekeepers nodded at him the way men nod at a thunderhead that waters their corn without flattening it. There were enemies too, who muttered his name like a hex. And there were the usual cowards who saved their bravado for saloons after his back was turned. None of them changed his gait. Every life holds a trial that is not a courtroom trial. For Reeves, the reckoning walked toward him wearing his own features and his own last name. Word traveled fast and in the wrong order, as it always does when grief carries it. A domestic quarrel, a knife, a woman dead, and Benny Reeves, Bass's son, at the center of the ruin. The office fell still. No one wanted the paper that came next. The warrant for Benny lay on the desk like a rattlesnake, quiet but coiled with meaning. Men who had ridden with Bass kept their eyes on their boots. Someone cleared his throat and then pretended he hadn't. Duty is a fine word in a courthouse and a bitter taste at a kitchen table. Reeves stepped forward and took the warrant without ceremony. He had spent a lifetime proving that law could be both firm and fair. Now the law asked whether he was willing to let it measure his own house by the same yard. Outside, Muskogee's dust swirled in a small circle the way dust does when a door opens, and a hard wind sees its chance. Bass folded the warrant, placed it next to the badge that had always ridden over his heart, and went looking for his son. The warrant lay on the desk like a coiled snake no one wished to name. Men who would ride into a canyon full of rifles without blinking kept their eyes on their boots. The room held its breath. News had come chopped and ragged, as bad news always does. A quarrel turned to rage, a blade or bullet depending on who told it, a woman fallen, a wife, and Benny Reeves at the center of the wreckage. There are papers a marshal reaches for by reflex, feeling the law steady his hand. This one was different. It knew his name and it knew his house. Bass stepped forward. He did not clear his throat. He did not ask for time. He picked up the warrant, folded it once, precisely like a man folding the corner of a map, and slid it into the pocket above his heart, where the badge already rode. The movement was small. The meaning was enormous. Duty in the mouth is a clean word. Duty in the bones is a weight. He nodded once to the room, and no one quite met his eye because what they felt was not pity, but respect carved into something sharper. Muskogee's streets were dust white and hot when he set out. He moved like weather as he always had. Only this time the storm line was inside him. If he remembered anything from the miles he'd ridden for stranger sons, it was that nerves are noisy while grief is quiet. He rode round the block before turning onto his boy's street, as if the extra minute could blunt a sharp edge, as if mercy could be borrowed on credit from the small courtesies of a horseman. Not rushing, not arriving with a clatter, not letting the neighborhood learn its lesson from iron alone. Accounts differ on the exact shape of what came next. Some say Bass walked up the steps and put irons on his son with hands that did not tremble. Others say Benny, hearing who was coming, surrendered without a show, because pride has no useful work to do when the man in the doorway taught you what pride costs. In either telling the same truth stands. The badge weighed more than blood that day, and Bass Reeves did not set it aside. He walked his boy toward the jail with the same measured dignity he gave strangers. The steps steady, the tone even, the eyes forward. No sermon. The streets gave way before them on either hand, people turning their faces with the instinct that tells a body to witness and to look away in the same heartbeat. In the jailhouse light, harsh as noon on a tin roof, the clerk's pen scratched. A deputy opened the ledger to the correct page. Benny answered questions that sounded like stones dropped in a well. Name, age, place of birth, each answer pulling the rope another notch. Bass did not touch his son's shoulder. He let the paperwork do the touching, because on the frontier, paper is where pain becomes history. When it was finished, he left the room without looking back. He would not steal from justice the thing it requires in every man, the willingness to be measured. Word leapt ahead of the ink. In saloons and on church steps, in creek neighborhoods and along the trader roads where flour dust whitened a man's boots, people spoke low and shook their heads. They were not surprised, they were chastened. An outlaw's fear is one kind of respect. This was another. If Reeves would bring in his own, what refuge could any lesser man claim? Out on the range, men who had once joked about hiding in the blackjack oak felt the joke sour on their tongues. The badge had always looked heavy on Bass. Now they realized how heavy. The trial moved on, rails the way all trials do. Timetables and continuances, a judge's calendar, a prosecutor's method. the defense's threadbare hope, the facts assembled with a carpenter's exactness and the haste of grief. There was no glamour in it. A life ended in a room where rage outpaced sense. Another life would now be measured in bars and days. The sentence carried Benny to Leavenworth, and people said the name like a cold room. The penitentiary had its own weather, its own clock. It counted men differently than the frontier did. Some later said Benny found a hard kind of steadiness there, that time sanded his temper, that sorrow taught what no father's hand could teach once the line had been crossed. But those lessons, if secured, belonged to Benny and to the iron that kept time around him. What belonged to Bass was the silence after. A father's grief does not announce itself. It sits with a man at breakfast and in the stable. It rides behind him like a second shadow. He kept working. It is what he knew. He took warrants without selecting for ease or danger, the way a blacksmith lifts any bar placed on the anvil. He still preferred living prisoners to dead men's biographies. He still took care with the coffee and the horses, because a camp that runs on small mercies makes room for larger justice. The difference lay beneath the surface. He watched young men more closely and listened for the one note in their voices that sounds like powder drying in the sun. When he heard it, he leaned a little forward and spoke a little softer, as if tone itself could be a safety on a pistol. The incident did not make him cruel. It made him more exacting with himself. Before dawn, he inspected the rifle with a ritual care that recalled 1887 in Leach, oiled the hinge, worked the action, watched the bolt face with the patient suspicion mechanics reserve for parts that have betrayed them once. He placed his hat on his head with a practiced motion, and as he did, remembered the story out there in the nations about the time a bullet took that hat clean off and left the man unshaken. He did not think himself bulletproof. He thought of himself as accountable to the court, to the people, to the better angels who still bothered to ride these roads. Around him, the territory itself was changing its clothes. Rail lines came shouldering in with iron confidence. Whistles split the morning. Stations grew around water tanks like towns blooming around wells. Telegraph wire stitched sky to sky. The old distances, once a refuge for men who lived on aliases, were shrinking. In Muskogee, the courthouse filled with the hum of a place that understood the future was already knocking. Schools, shops, a barber whose chair had the polished glow of too much talk. Bass moved through those rooms like a figure stamped in an older coin still accepted at the counter. Not flashy, but trusted. He worked on into the first years of the century, a veteran writing a map whose edges were being erased by surveyors and clerks. The Five Nations policed their own, as they had, and still the federal court's arm reached across the weave. Bass did as he had always done. Asked cooperation, not indulgence. Brought warrants like tools, not threats. Talked when talking would spare a woman her husband's body, and fought when fighting would spare a bystander's life. He collected no trophies. He collected instead a reputation that traveled faster than a telegraph. Steady, fair, unyielding. And then the calendar itself changed shape. 1907 dawned, and with it, Oklahoma statehood, stamped hard into the paper by men in distant rooms. The old federal court system for the territory, under which Bass had ridden for 32 long years, dissolved like a river coming to a confluence. One jurisdiction swallowed by another, its currents still felt but its name gone from the map. Men cleaned out desks. Ledgers closed with a flat sound. Deputies who had measured their lives in miles suddenly found themselves standing still. The habit of listening for hoofbeats replaced by a different hearing. The muffled echo of a courthouse going quiet. Bass carried his badge back to the office where his commission had begun its grind years ago and set it on the desk with the same respect he had shown the warrant for his son. The metal had warmed to him. For a moment he thought he could feel the residue of all the names it had helped pronounce aloud. He did not try to count them. He had never been a man for monuments to himself. He merely thanked the clerk, because manners are another form of law, and stepped into the street. The air tasted of coal smoke and new paint. Somewhere a hammer rang, and beyond it a harmonica wandered into a tune that could have been a prayer if you squinted. The old world had ended without fanfare. No parade, no riderless horse, just a man on a city sidewalk in a state no longer called a territory, considering what a life's worth of work amounts to when the work itself has been folded into the nation that asked for it. If thunder is memory, the town carried plenty of it. each porch and alley a reminder of times he had kept the night civil. He adjusted his hat and walked on. What does a lawman do when the trail he has ridden for 3 decades becomes a street with a timetable? The answer waited just around the corner, where a different badge would offer itself not as glory, but as service. But that, as the saying goes, is another mile. Statehood came down like a new sign tacked over an old doorway. Oklahoma 1907. And with it the great machine of federal justice that had hammered across Indian territory folded into a different order. Desks were cleared, ledgers shut, gallows timbers left to weather into memory. A man who had once measured his life in hoofbeats and miles now found himself walking blocks beneath electric lamps. Bass Reeves handed back his deputy's commission and took a city post in Muskogee, a policeman among storefronts and streetcars, proof that duty need not be dramatic to be real. They said the beat stayed quiet when Bass walked it, that trouble recognized him as a fellow professional and decided to take the evening off. Perhaps that is myth. Perhaps it is merely the shape truth takes when set down in a town that learned what calm sounds like. Policing a city drew on a different craft, less wilderness sense, and more attention to the small arithmetic of streets. Reeves learned timetables now instead of cattle trails, when the switchman crossed for dinner, when the hotel emptied into the avenue, when payday swelled the saloons with rough optimism. He carried himself the way he always had, hat level, shoulders squared from years of saddle, voice even as a judge's scale. If a drunk struck a false note on the corner, Bass tuned it without flair. If a clerk shouted after a boy who'd run off with a loaf of bread, Bass decided who needed a warning and who needed a cell. The work was quieter, but no less exacting. A man's temper breaks in a parlor as surely as it breaks on the range. Justice must fit both rooms. Age pays what youth borrows. Bright's disease began its slow arithmetic. Fatigue where strength had once stood on call, a thirst that could not be slaked, a heaviness in the joints that felt like old miles collecting their due. His mustache salted itself. His gaze did not dim. He still rose before most men, polished his boots until the leather took light, and checked his pistol with that same priestly care he had learned after the camp tragedy that had once put him on trial. Young officers watched him the way apprentices watch a master smith. For the small motions, the habits that keep a tool true. Bass showed them how to walk into a quarrel with their hands open and their minds already counting, how to stand so a man has no excuse to be afraid and every reason to behave. In the quieter hours, memory rode with him. Not the gore, the West remembers that on its own, but the ledger entries that add up to a life. 32 years under a federal badge. More than 3,000 arrests by the tallies preserved in government histories and newspapers. 14 dead by his hand, always in self-defense, each shot landing like a nail pounded in necessity, never in pride. He had once said little and let the record speak. Now the record spoke when he said nothing at all. Shopkeepers nodded as he passed, the way farmers nod at a storm that both waters and warns. Children thought he made the street safer by the angle of his hat alone. And the outlaws, who still lived in the high grass of rumor, muttered his name the way men mutter a weather sign, half caution, half superstition. The West around him wore a new face. Rail lines had stitched it to the rest of the republic. Telegraph and newspapers quickened its pulse. The nation's sovereignty had been carved and parceled by the Dawes Act, allotment turning communal land into rectangles with surveyor numbers, changing the old braid of jurisdiction into a frayed rope where arguments caught. Freedmen communities contended for rights promised and rights withheld. In such a place, a black lawman's steady authority meant more than any single arrest. It was a declaration that the badge could hold a weight beyond the century's prejudice. Bass never sermonized about that, but his daily presence said it for him. The republic can, if it chooses, keep its word. Legend kept pace with fact, as it always does where the ground is big and the horizon encourages story. The claim arose, then multiplied like seeds on the wind, that the Lone Ranger had been inspired by Reeves. There were parallels worth a listener's nod. Disguises, native scouts, a strict code against unnecessary killing, even tales of silver coins pressed into a grateful palm. But history, as Reeves himself would have reminded anyone who asked, prefers proof to romance. The link remains unproven, a bright idea riding alongside the record without ever catching its stirrup. What needs no embroidery is the truth that Bass Reeves embodied the thing dime novels only imagined. A relentless peace officer who could ride into a wilderness of lies and come out with the right man and a clear conscience. Death, when it came, did not arrive with fanfare. January 12, 1910, the winter light thin as skimmed milk, Bass Reeves succumbed to Bright's disease at 71. The news traveled county by county on paper that smeared if the ink got damp. In parlors and barber shops, men folded away their talk and said the same simple phrase: he was steady. Funerals on the frontier are honest. There is no energy for theatrics in cold weather, and the measure of a life is taken in how a town behaves once the ground is tamp level. Muskogee behaved as if a sound had gone missing, that even tread on a night patrol, the unhurried voice that shifted a crowd from heat to reason, the surety that if a warrant bore your name, it would be read to you, not shouted at you. Afterward, time did what it always does. It sanded the edges and left the grain. Statues rose where he had once tied his horse. Bridges took his name. Museums set out his photograph. The dark coat, the level gaze, the mustache, the color of sunlit straw gone winter pale. School children learned that a former slave had become one of the greatest peace officers of the West, riding for a court so vast that the map itself had to be reminded where its borders lay. In Fort Smith, in Muskogee, in towns that wear their history like a brand that has both marked and dignified them, the story found its proper size. Not fairy tale, not pamphlet, but an example. If you wanted to argue about heroes, Bass gave you the only kind worth keeping. Those who choose skill over swagger, patience over panic, law over blood when the day demanded it. His legacy is not only in bronze and stone, it is in craft. Ask any peace officer worth the name about memory and method, and you'll hear the old lessons in new tongues. Learn the country, learn the people. Let quiet do as much work as steel. Do not squander a life you can bring home in irons. Keep your tools clean and your accounts cleaner. Let the law be spoken aloud so everyone present hears the same sentence and knows the same measure. These are not romantic notions. They are habits, and habits are what outlast storms. Stand at dusk on the Arkansas River and listen. Freight hums where steamboats used to lean against the current, but the water still speaks the same language it spoke when Reeves crossed it with prisoners guarded and miles to go. The sky stacks bruised clouds on the horizon the way it did when he watched for campfire smoke, and the twitch in a horse's ear that means company. A rider appears if you let your mind frame him. A silhouette with hat brim low, the kind of presence that steadies men and unsettles guilt. Iron and thunder. The iron was in his will, in the code that would not break under debt or grief. The thunder was in the way his name carried, arriving a few heartbeats before he did, and clearing rooms without a shout. What remains when the dust falls? A simple answer, as most true ones are. Character. In a century that frequently bent the rules toward the powerful and the pale, Bass Reeves kept his line straight and his hand open. He was not the fastest draw or the loudest boast. He was the man who showed up, listened hard, and left with the work done. The West, for all its bluster, was built by such men and women, those who lifted more than they bragged and believed that a warrant, properly read, could be a civic prayer. So if you find yourself asking what kind of figure the Wild West required at its sharpest edges, you do not need to open a dime novel or search for a mask and a white horse. You need only the image of a tall black marshal whose courage chose precision over noise, who learned a land that had tried to unlearn him, and who rode its length until it learned better. The rest is weather moving over grass, impressive, temporary. The work Bass Reeves did is the part that stays.